when the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'm bringing more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within than the things may appear. You're looking into my heart. If you know the song, I'm coming back. I'm sorry, Lord. The words I attempted to sing, and you sang quite beautifully, were penned by a worship leader, songwriter named Matt Redman, and this came after a season of introspection for a church called Soul Survivor in England. The pastor at the time, Mike Pellavacci, believed that while there was nothing wrong with the church, the bass player was showing up on time, he said. The musicians were prepared. They held worship festivals. He felt that something had slipped and that they had drifted from glorifying Christ as the center of their worship to having preferences about their worship style, having a pride about their approach to worship. So he did a bold move that rippled across the world, actually at the time. This is in the late 90s. And he stopped the music. People would come in, they would sing songs a cappella, they would pray together, but there was no lights, no sound, no anything. Just everything stripped down to its essence, and it was an object lesson for the church. And this happened for several weeks. And then over the course of that time, their worship pastor, Matt Redman, wrote the song, Heart of Worship. Cool story. That is until Mike Pellavacci was exposed for pastoral abuse and sexual abuse in the church, acting out against young men. And during the time where he was calling and challenging the church to such heartfelt worship, was practicing something that was the complete opposite of what was being presented. The trustees or elders of the church made this statement: to all those victims who have been deeply impacted and continue to be, we are profoundly sorry. As trustees and leaders of Soul Survivor, we want you to know that we have heard you. We also want to thank those of you who came forward and shared your experiences for this report, many of you for the second time. We acknowledge your bravery, as this must have been incredibly difficult. You have directly influenced the learnings and recommendations made in an investigative report. We will always be grateful for that. We accept the report's findings that over the years there were people in positions of leadership and governance of the ministries of Soul Survivor who knew or were made aware of Mike Pellavacci's behavior. This includes inappropriate relationships with young men, ghosting, inappropriate physical conduct, wrestling, and massages, as well as his coercive, bullying, and controlling behavior. We also accept those in a position of leadership and governance who knew about Mike Pellavacci's behavior should have taken steps to report it at the time, leading to an investigation into his behavior. Moreover, we also agree that a series of governance failures to provide proper management, accountability, and oversight of Mike Pellavacci facilitated a culture that gave him the license to operate as he did. Throughout Soul Survivor's history, there has been an overemphasis on his gifts and success, which contributed to the blindness towards his behavior. Again, we're sorry, particularly to those who tried to raise concerns and were not listened to. It really matters when Christian leaders fail. And it is a scary thought, a sobering thought for anyone in a role of spiritual leadership, whether you are an elder or a pastor, a parent, a teacher. When we have spiritual authority entrusted to us by God, it is a sobering thing to take it seriously and to never use a platform for personal gain. The idea of celebrity pastor is one that has hurt the church. And it has to be guarded against in every local church everywhere. So go the leaders, so go the people. Do you agree with that statement? So go the leaders, so go the people. So go the parents, so go the kids and their kids. So go the pastors. So goes the church. As we've been walking through the book of Judges together, there's been a group of leaders that have been eerily silent, purposefully silent throughout the narrative. We have had the introduction. Let's just look at the overall arching structure of the book. We'll put this on the screen. We had an introduction prologue that ushers God's people into the promised land. They find themselves there. They have their territories. They just need to follow the Lord and faithfully go ahead and take control of the entire region. And they set out to do it, and they start so well. And then the prologue shows us that they did not fully trust and follow the Lord, and they did not conquer the land as God intended. And this began a cycle, a spiral-bound cycle into chaos, starting really well with Othniel, and then getting into the depths of despair with Samson. This prologue leads into the spiral cycle, which then leads into the epilogue. And what has been missing has been the spiritual leaders of the people. Where are the Levites? Where are the priests? Where are the ones who are supposed to be the voice of God, to know the law of God, to call the people into repentance and sacrifice, and to honor the king? Where are the Levites? Well, guess what, my friends? They are here in the epilogue. And do you think it's going to be good news? You're like, well, David, based on your exciting and happy intro, we can only guess and surmise it is not going to go well. What we have in the epilogue is we're going to have two sections, 17 through 18 and then 19 through 21, that is going to show the absolute collapse of God's people. And what's interesting is that you will not find in these chapters from 17 through 21, you're not going to find much commentary from the narrator, except one repeated concept that is throughout this in 4 verses. And this is the key verse or the key phrase of the epilogue. It says this. It's found in Judges 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, 21, 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is the only commentary the narrator is going to give through this story, or through the stories told, that is going to be the highlight, There is an absolute collapse of the people of God. And the only commentary that's given, or the only rationale, is there was no just and faithful king for God's people, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And what we have playing out in this collapse in these passages is what happens to God's people where there is no spiritual leadership and there is no moral mirroring of their faith. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. When we take a look at this epilogue, it's really in two collapses that we see there. You can see this on the screen. Without a just, faithful king, there were two types of collapse. What are they? Number one, if we can go to the next slide. I'll just tell you, it's spiritual collapse and moral collapse. Please don't pay attention to the screen. Screens, who needs them? Jesus didn't have a screen.
Alex fixed it.
Good job. Everyone say, good job, Alex. Yeah. Two kinds of collapse. Technological collapse. Spiritual collapse. And what's the second one? Moral collapse. You can understand the message that God has for His people in the epilogue of Judges by remembering two collapses. Spiritual collapse and moral collapse. We're going to talk through this text. And really where we're headed is to do some serious introspection and reflection. This is kind of the overarching point of the message of Judges for His people, for God's people, is that reading through this spiral-bound cycle leaves you in a place of going, we are desperate for a just and faithful king. We are desperate for a just and faithful king. I know you're feeling it because I'm feeling it. You come into Humble Bible Churches, can we just talk about Jesus for a little while? I know you're feeling that, and that's an intentional thing of when are we going to get to Jesus? Because if you've been traveling with us, it's just been this decline of bad news and worse news. So we're going to look at this first section of the epilogue, the spiritual collapse. And really, this is going to break down into both sections. Both types of collapse will have an individual and a tribal. An individual collapse and a tribal collapse. So here's where things begin. There's a man named Micah, and he has a mother. The mother could be Delilah, maybe not, but she has 1,100 pieces of silver, which Delilah had at least 1,100 pieces of silver, and her silver's gone. Someone has stolen her silver, and she pronounces, I'm going to curse someone who has taken my silver. And her son, Micah, is like, uh-oh, Mama, I'm so sorry. I'm the one who took your silver. And she says, oh, blessed are you for telling me the truth. Let's make it into an idol. He says, great idea. So they turn this silver, they have it smelted, like that word, fashioned into an ephod, which is a priestly garment, which this is all kinds of wrong. They fashion into this priestly garment. They make idols out of it for the home. And he turns to his boys in the house and he's like, all right, you guys are going to be my priests. And that is until one day a Levite comes along from the area of Bethlehem, and he's journeying, and he comes to them, and Micah's like, you're a Levite. Why don't you come in? Let me pay you a healthy sum of silver, and you be my priest in my house. And the Levite is like, let's make a deal. Let's make a deal. And so that's exactly what he does. He comes into Micah's house. He gets the money. He sets everything up. And I just want to draw your attention to verses 11 through 13 of chapter 17. It says, and the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah ordained the Levite, and the young man became his priest and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as priest. Spiritual worship had become an act of superstition. Very superstitious. Riding on the wall. Yeah. His mother was superstitious. Someone took my silver. I'm going to curse them. He didn't want to be cursed. He confessed it. They turned it into idols. And then he thinks he's going to have a privileged place with God because he was able to bribe a Levitical priest and have him in his house. He had his special God man in his life. This moves us into chapter 18. So we move from an individual collapse. First of all, let me just say, the Levite, he should never have left where he was. He should never have accepted the role that he was, because Levites were supposed to be in cities that were designated for them to serve God's people amongst the tribes. Well, here he is, going out on his own. He's not where God had called him to be. He's out on his own. He finds himself in another place, getting rich and fat off of this guy's ignorance. A spiritual leader profiting off the ignorance of a man. And then along comes the tribe of Dan. Now, what do we know about the tribe of Dan? This is Judges 18. Well, if you go back to Judges chapter 1, Dan is listed as the first tribe that they could not secure any of their promised land. They got kicked out, and they had to resettle amongst their brothers in other tribal allotment areas because they did not trust God, they did not follow God, and they didn't get their place. And so Dan comes along, and they've got 600 warriors, and they're like, it's time for us to rise up and take our place. And so they're marching, looking for good land to take, and guess whose house they go by? They go by Micah. And what do they find in Micah's house? $1,100 worth of awesome idolatry. And they're like, let's take it. And they take it. And the Levite comes out and goes, yo, you can't take that. They said, we can, and we will take you. He's like, can I keep that? They're like, of course. He's like, then let's go. So the Levite goes along with this tribe of Dan. The text mentions that they go right by Shiloh, which is a little nod to the reader that Shiloh is actually where the Ark of the Covenant is. It's where the main tabernacle is, the main house of worship there is. And they just march right on past Shiloh. And they go to an area called Laish. Say that with me. Laish. Laish is important because Laish sits outside of the promised land. God had called his people to a defined boundary that he had given them. And Dan, they come to the border, they see a city over there, and they go, let's take it. They send in spies, and this is supposed to remind you of the Israelites in Kadesh Barnea, where they sent spies in, and at the beginning of Joshua, where they sent spies into Jericho. Here they are, sending spies again. This time, they're going to a people that the Lord had not designated or devoted to destruction. And they see that they're quiet, and they're unsuspecting, and they're ripe for the taking. So they destroy it and settle it. They set up their own house of worship, and they do it all in the name of Yahweh. They do it all in the name of God. It's not idolatry that they're worshiping a false god, but they're making idols as their worship to God. They have lost their way. Listen to this in Judges 18, starting verse 27. It says, but the people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priests who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. Then they rebuilt the city and lived in it, and they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved images for themselves. Get this. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. The narrator leaves the Levite unnamed until the end of chapter 18. The Levite who left Bethlehem to go into the house of Micah, who abandoned the house of Micah to go with the tribe of Dan, was Moses' grandson. You guys remember Moses? And in 2 generations' time, you have a tribe of God's people completely gone astray. There is an absolute spiritual collapse. There's no knowledge of God, no practice of God, and yet out of their lips they are giving worship to God. There is an absolute individual and tribal spiritual collapse. And then we go into chapter 19, which I got to say, chapter 19, as we move into moral collapse, is one of the most horrific chapters in all of Scripture. A Levite leaves Bethlehem, or comes into, it says in verse 19, in those days there was no king in Israel. A certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. First of all, there's another Levite. He has taken a woman for pleasure and made her his concubine, which Levites were not supposed to do. They could be married to a wife, but not to collect women for their pleasure. He's done that. She becomes unfaithful to him. He goes after her. He wants to redeem her. He wants to have her back for his pleasure. She goes to her father's house. He goes there. The father says, stay with us, stay with us, stay with us. And eventually the man is like, I want to take her back to my home. And he's like, I'm going to stop in Jerusalem, or it was also known as Jebus. And they were like, you don't want to stay there. Like, you don't want to spend an overnight in Jebus. That's not where you want to go. It'd be better for you to go to Gibeah. If you go to Gibeah, then or at least there's going to be other Israelites there. So please don't stop in Jerusalem. Go to Gibeah, where at least God's people will be there. So they go to Gibeah. No one would take them in. Now, Levites are supposed to be held in high regard, but no one would give them a place to stay. Then one older man comes out from the field and he sees them, and the Levite says, I can bless you, I've got provisions, I've got money, we just need a place to stay. So they go in, and then what happens? The tribe of Benjamin comes forward to the door, and they are demanding that they can have their physical way with his guests. And women are offered up as a solution, and ultimately it is the Levite's concubine who is set outside. And she is brutalized and taken advantage of until she dies. Upon her death, that very next morning, the Levite comes out, and this is what he says. And this will show you the absolute collapse, because this comes out of the mouth of one of God's leaders. Judges 19, verse 27, and her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let us be going. after everything that happened to her, he says, get up. Let's go. Where's the compassion? Where's the protection? Do you see how absent it is? This is a Levite. This is a man of God. This is a man who's supposed to know the law. He put her on a donkey, rose up and went away to his home, and he entered his house, took a knife, taking hold of his concubine. He divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. This is as bad as it gets, right? Mutilates her, sends her body parts around the tribes, and he calls on the tribes for a response. Individual moral collapse. Another Levite not doing what he ought to do, not in a relationship that he ought to have, exposes a woman to unbelievable horror and danger. And she ends up paying the price with her life. And then this message is sent to the whole tribe. So you have this individual collapse from the very person that should have stood against it. The book of Judges, as you read it, it does raise this question of where are the leaders of God's people? Well, we're seeing the condition of God's people in a time when Israel had no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, even the spiritual leaders. So then what happens from the tribal front with complete moral collapse? Well, the tribes come together to destroy the tribe of Benjamin, the ones who did this. And this is how far we've fallen when we come into this section in Judges 20. If you look at verses 27, 28, it says, and the people of Israel inquired of Yahweh the Lord, for the ark of the covenant was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So it's interesting, with the first Levite, we have ties to Moses' grandson. In this occasion, now we have ties to Aaron's grandson. The people of God had come against the tribe of Benjamin. They tried to attack them, and actually Benjamin got the better of them. And so they have to go back to God and say, is this what you're wanting us to do? And the actual high priest for God's people is the one who goes before the Lord, and here the Lord sanctions and permits the tribes to destroy one of his own sons of Israel, the entire tribe of Benjamin. So a war breaks out. And we have civil war that goes through the rest of Judges 20. Benjamin is put down. And now there's only 600 men who remain for the tribe of Benjamin, and they need wives. So rather than looking to the Lord for provision for those that remained, they just hatch a plan to take women, virgin women, for themselves. They go to an area, Jabesh Gilead, because they did not fight against Benjamin. So the call went out to all the tribes, we got to fight Benjamin. Jabesh Gilead, they said, no. So the Israelite tribes said, well, then we're going to take your women. And so they went and they took them. There wasn't enough, though. They needed more. For these 600 men. They needed more women. And so at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, there were young women who would worship through dance. And so they said, hey, let's let Benjamin go and take them. Take them from their father's house, have their way with them, and make them become your wives. Judges 21, starting verse 16. The elders of the congregation said, what shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin? And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters. They had made a vow before God. We will not give this tribe our daughters. For the people of Israel had sworn, cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, behold, there is a yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebonah. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and then go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. And they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. This whole final part of the moral collapse of the epilogue is intended to draw our attention to the connection that God's people are no longer living as God's people, but they're living like Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a parallel between Judges 19 and Genesis 19. There's complete moral collapse. It has happened individually, and it has happened tribally, corporately. In the days of the judges, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. I have a question for you. Which is more offensive to you, the moral or the spiritual collapse? I wrestled with this question over the course of the week, because when you read Judges 19 through 21, the details, they are genuinely horrific. It is definitely one of those passages that when you read it, it's like, what am I supposed to, how do I apply that to my life? But I was sitting there thinking about the connection between the spiritual collapse and the moral collapse, the absolute putting the name of God to shame, and then the ramifications of what a life does that has no heart for God. Yet when I was studying it and I was reading it, I felt more of an offense over the second half than the first. And I just sensed the Lord saying, drawing my attention that while they are both obviously evil and wicked and wrong, the moral collapse was a result of the spiritual collapse. The great irony is that those who were supposed to have been the closest to the Lord, the most dedicated to the Lord, they were the most complicit in the spiritual collapse of God's people, which then led to the absolute moral decay. Do you see how far we've fallen? Do you remember Joshua? Do you remember when we started there? Choose this day whom you'll serve. He says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And they said, we will serve the Lord. And it was this incredible moment for God's people. And now they are brutal, ignorant of the ways of God, and they have put his name to shame. And the only commentary through this section is there was no just and faithful king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But for me, the area where I sensed that the Lord was saying, David, I need you to pay attention to this, is your heart. Moral collapse follows spiritual collapse. That's the connection. Moral collapse follows spiritual collapse. Judges 17 and 18, idolatry. 19 through 21, immorality, anarchy, and injustice. This is reminiscent, or this will be something that is tied to the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus calls out things like murder and adultery. He condemns these things, but what does he say is the deeper issue? It's the matter of the heart. It's the anger, it's the lust, it's the things in our that reside in the human heart, our stubbornness that ends up playing out through our decisions and our actions. Moral collapse follows spiritual collapse. So here's what we want to do this morning. Is I want to challenge you with a time of personal reflection. We're going to participate in this together privately. We're going to have a time of just kind of quiet reflection and response. And I'd like for your time to begin like this. Lord, I lay my sins before you. They are. And then this question, Lord, what are the idols behind my sin? If I'm walking in stubbornness and pride, Lord, what is the idol behind that? What is the belief that is resulting in that? Whatever that sin is, Lord, here are my sins. I lay them before you. Here's what they are. What are the idols behind my sin? And then a confession. I confess that you, Jesus, are my just and faithful King. Let me give you this time for quiet reflection.